This is our second straight optional video, and in this video we will be talking about dynamic EQ in the mixing process. Just as a reminder, because we haven't brought this up in a little while, remember that if you're making music and then you're mixing music, oftentimes these tasks and these roles can kind of blend together. So don't feel as though in the mixing stage you have to do a lot if you've already taken a lot of these steps when you were making the music. And it's very possible that you have already taken a lot of these steps. The thing to keep in mind is in the mix, you're really focused on context. So, how does every move not only impact that individual sound, but more specifically, how is it related to everything else that's going on? This is why it's so critical to set that rough balance to begin with, because you might apply processing somewhere thinking it needs it, only to then put it into the mix and realize that no, it actually fits without it. All right, so I just want to bring that up one more time because I think it's really important, and we can get so engrossed in the technology and in all of the options and in wanting to do a lot to every individual sound, forgetting the big picture, which is how is everything sounding together. But let's jump in here and talk about dynamic EQ because for me, if I had only one processor that I could use on a mix, for example, I would choose a dynamic EQ. And the reason is pretty obvious. You get the visual feedback, the familiarity of that EQ interface, something that we've looked at a lot now, plus the added control of the movement that you normally get with some kind of dynamic processor, so a compressor or a limiter. And dynamic EQ, for whatever reason, is considered as more of like an advanced processor, and it doesn't change the way that we're thinking about fix it, enhance it, or blend it. But what it does do is combine these two powerful effects that are normally used apart from one another, puts them together into something that's easy for even a beginner to see and understand. And in my opinion, this is why I think in the next 5, 10, 15 years, dynamic EQ is going to become a lot more used, especially for modern mixing tasks, because it does exactly what you need it to do and can be used at a number of different levels, both on individual tracks, on buses, or on the final master output. So function, what's the function of a dynamic EQ? And we've already talked about this a little bit in the production stage, but thanks to the dynamic movement of this particular processor, we are able to add an extra dimension to the effect, making it more appropriate for many tasks. And you can also then do things in a lot more of a subtle way. So you remember when we were talking about EQ, we talked about it being a static effect. And one of its big flaws, if you can call it a flaw, is that it's static. But with the dynamic EQ, it's not. It's dynamic. It moves. It reacts to the signal that's coming in. And therefore, if we want to use it in a fix-it context, for example, like a really SE vocal, this becomes very powerful because instead of just having to notch out a frequency throughout the entire time, we only will have to notch it out when it gets unruly, when it's too loud, when it keeps poking and peeking through. And that's when we can use the dynamic EQ just to pull it down so that for the rest of the time, when that particular frequency band is still being excited, when it's still being heard thanks to harmonics and other consonants and other vowels, or just, the room modes, whatever, we don't lose it. It's not a constant loss. It's only being brought down when it needs to be. So you can be a lot more subtle with the move, and it also blends a lot better. And the same thing can be said for like a resonant frequency like we looked at before with Fix It. If I was to use a dynamic EQ, I would only have to pull it down when that particular frequency was overexcited. All right, same thing with plosives. So if I go like plosives like that, you can hear that kind of low end pop, and you can remove that using a dynamic EQ a lot better or more efficiently or in a more subtle way than if you're just to notch out a lot of low end. What if the signal still has a lot of really good warmth and energy down in the low end? You don't want to use like a shelf and just take it all away. You want to go with a dynamic EQ so that it's only pulling it down when it gets unruly. And then you can also use a dynamic EQ in the enhance it role, which is what we're going to look at in the example because we've already done more of a fix it role in the production stage in that optional video. So with enhance it, you don't have to maybe make such extreme settings. You can actually use the movement characteristic to, it's not even the same really as an EQ anymore, but it just adds this extra dimension to it. It enhances the sound by giving you that movement plus the frequency control. So I have to like go a step further with another slide and just title it movement, because that's really what this is all about. Dynamic EQ, in my opinion, should be introduced to people before the concept of compression, because it's so much easier to understand with the interfaces and the plugins that we have today. Because we often think of compression and limiting as reducing dynamic range, which is one function of it, but this is really a major misconception, especially in the mixing portion of any kind of production. There's a big difference between limiting dynamic range, which I think we can specifically refer to as peak reduction, and changing the perceived dynamic of a part. So an example I would give you is, let's say you have a snare drum and you want to emphasize the transient more. In the past, the way we would have gone about doing that, in this course specifically, is to put on the transient shaper and say, okay, I want to emphasize that first transient, let's add boost there, right? Or whatever it is that you have to do on the transient shaper. More attack. I forget like how that works. More bitter or more sweet. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, that's basically just a compressor that's saying, okay, what I want to do is I want to have an attack time that's long enough so that it's not impacting that initial transient, and let's pull down what happens immediately following. So if you do that and you use a compressor for that reason, what are you actually doing? You're actually increasing dynamic range. You're not decreasing it at that point. So while a compressor and a limiter can and are often used to bring down peaks, that's not always the case. And I think it's really important to make that point here, especially as we move in and start to talk about compression. Adding bounce and or movement, or whatever adjective you want to use, is actually a pretty critical mixing task when you consider the peak limiting, so the actual limiting of dynamic range, normally applied on the master bus in a mixing context or during mastering. Okay, so what you want to do as a mix engineer is you want to keep things bouncing. You want to keep things moving. That's just a major component of all music in general. You know, if you limit the heck out of everything, if there is no movement in individual parts or the mix as a whole, it kind of falls apart and it's not interesting anymore, because you're just hearing like a wall of sound. And the wall of sound can be cool for some styles of music, but for most music, you want to have some movement and some life that's still there. And you know at the end that it's going to be peak limited to bring up that decrease the dynamic range, bring up the overall perceived loudness. So in the mixing stage, you actually have to do even more to make sure that you are enhancing or changing the perceived dynamic of individual parts. So with dynamic EQ, we really have the best of both worlds here. I think we can control frequencies specifically that we want to control, and then have them move accordingly based on the incoming signal. So if you're a little bit more experienced and advanced and you know all the processors, you might be asking the question, what's the difference between a multiband compressor, which separates out different frequency bands and gives you a compressor for each one, and a dynamic EQ? And in practice, there really is no difference, other than a dynamic EQ can be more flexible because you can alter the shape of the bell, or alter the shape of the shelf that's being brought down. With a multiband compressor, that's usually something that's hardwired in there, and it's based off of the crossover frequencies that you set. So this comes back to, again, that was probably confusing to some of you beginners, and then the whole point is the dynamic EQ is more flexible and easy to understand. Dynamic EQs tend to be cleaner on the EQ side because they still can be used as just a traditional equalizer. And the intuitiveness, visual feedback of a dynamic EQ is by far superior to the majority of multiband compressors that I've at least seen or worked with. And I also want to make this point now as well, that a compressor is just as much a tonal shaper as it is a dynamic one. Because if you think about it, there's no sound, with the exception of just like a sine wave, that is going to have an equal amplitude at every single frequency across the board. That just doesn't happen. So when you're using a compressor, and let's say we're using it in a peak limit kind of way, so we're trying to bring down the peaks to bring up the overall loudness to decrease the dynamic range. If we're doing that, when we bring up the gain at the end, because we've brought down the peaks just of those frequencies that are going over the threshold, it means that we're now changing the overall tonal balance, because those additional partials or harmonics, whatever you want to call them, because they're being brought up now in context, it changes the entire tone of the instrument. And that's why, mix engineers who've worked a little bit longer, who've been doing this for a long time, don't really look at compressors simply as tools to change dynamic ranges. They're really listening and looking at them as tonal shapers just as much as dynamic ones. And last but not least, in a comparison to multiband compression versus dynamic EQ, as far as I know, dynamic EQ is really only possible in the digital domain. If it is possible in the analog domain, true hardware parts, no computer chips. I'm not saying you can't have a dynamic EQ in a hardware box, but there's probably some kind of computer chip in there. I think the cost or even the feasibility or practicality would be almost impossible. Okay, so this is something that's kind of new, and that's what I want to try to emphasize to you. You're not going to hear or see a lot of old school, surely out of the box mix engineers pull to dynamic EQs, but that's mainly because they just don't want to change. And they like the way they like the way their mix sounds without having to go to it. But in the modern age, and I think with more and more mix engineers being brought up now on computers and seeing these devices, you're going to start to see dynamic EQ used more and more in the mixing context. And just to take this all one step further, this is an image of a hardware multiband compressor, and just by looking at this, it's pretty confusing. It just looks like a bunch of knobs, and that's really what it is. But I just want you to look at this now, and we'll be able to compare and contrast what we see with the dynamic EQ that we're going to be bringing in and using to enhance that same kick drum sound that we worked with in the last video. But just to explain how this does work, in case you're curious, what we have here are basically 3 distinct bands, and I've never worked with this actual hardware unit, so I don't know if this is the low band or the high band, but let's imagine this is the low band up here, this is the mid band, and this is the high band. These 2 knobs are going to set your cutoff frequencies, or I should say your crossover frequencies. Okay, that's the technical term. So let's imagine that we set this to be 150 hertz. What this means is this top row of knobs is going to one compressor that's specifically focused on all frequencies in the signal 150 hertz and below. If there's nothing in the signal 150 hertz and below, this is completely meaningless and useless. But you just set up the compressor like you'd want it, and if you want to control something in the low end, you would use this one. This middle one here is now based on both crossover frequencies. So this was set to 150. Let's imagine this is set to 2K. That's a really wide range, but it for our purposes, it works fine. So what we have here then is a compressor that's only focused on any information in the signal between 150 and 2K, and then the last one would be 2K and above. So 1, 2, 3, these rows are all exactly the same. You have gain reduction meters here, and then you have, makeup gain on the out here. So that's pretty much the idea with a multiband compressor. But if you had no prior experience working with multiband compression, this would be a very confusing device to look at, whereas the dynamic EQ, it's really straightforward, and I think actually helps you make better decisions, because like with all of our processors, we want to have a reason for using them. Okay, if you don't have a good reason for putting something on, don't put it on in the first place. So let's jump into the DAW and take a look at one quick example of using a dynamic EQ in a enhance it function. All right, so the processor that we've probably looked at more than any other in this course thus far has been the TDR Nova, and we're going to drag and drop that on one more time here to talk about dynamic EQ. So first things first, if you're more of a beginner, having the spectrum analyzer on is definitely helpful, but as we discovered in the last video, it doesn't always necessarily help you in making decisions. It's based on your ear more than anything else. So just because you see something doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily like the sound of it. But let's go ahead and turn the analyzer on to in for right now, okay, just so we can see this sound and what it looks like in a spectrum analyzer. Cool. And first thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to put on that high pass filter so that we can get rid of anything that's, below even audible range until I hear something I like. So let's extreme it. Probably go a little more. That should be good. Cool, and let's just apply an EQ curve like what we had applied before, and then we'll get into the idea of using the dynamic EQ to then enhance this even a bit further. So I'm going to go ahead and start by adding a little bit of gain around where that fundamental is. And remember, we have an automatic gain compensation here, so everything we're doing is really specific to tonal changes. All right, so let's also go and change this to mono since this is a mono signal, just to make this more efficient. Okay, cool. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go back here. And if you notice, I haven't even touched any of the cues. If we want, we could sharpen these up. We could broaden these out. Maybe I'll broaden this one a little bit. Just so you can see that that is possible. But now what we want to do is we want to actually enhance our settings even further. Okay, and the way I'm going to do that is by going into the bands where, first of all, we're actually cutting here on number 2. And with number 4, we can actually drop this out a little bit as well. And it might be useful if we have a vocal or something where, you know, vocal range, really important in or around this 1K region or so. And so I'm going to go to number 2, and I'm just going to go ahead, bring in my threshold here. You can already see we're getting a little bit of movement. We're going to way overdo it here. Need to make sure that I tighten up that cue so that it's not impacting the move I've made up here. And the release now becomes kind of like the most important control, because if we're here at 120 BPM, we want to make sure the release comes back up before the next hit, okay? So that it has time to recover, so that it's really like you're hearing the bounce and you're hearing the movement. And if you have this in context with a lot of other parts going on, you'll definitely start to hear the effect that this has and how important it is to get those release times by ear and make sure it's blending well with the rest of the music. So. And then with our 4th band, which is sitting right here, I'm going to do a similar thing. In this case, though, I'm going to actually make the cue pretty broad. Let's just, again, turn this on. Bring that threshold down. Just trying to see that movement. And I'm probably going to want identical settings in this case. So that's all the way down to its lowest. And we have 21. Now we can bypass everything. Let's try to enhance this area a little bit more. Okay, cool, so bypassed. And let's check our gains so we can really level match this. Okay, we're peaking out here at minus 2.1. We're peaking out here at around minus 5, so we can bring in 3 dB of output gain. And now we have a fair comparison. So you can hear the additional impact that this movement has. And remember, it would be okay to take this second band here and bring it up in general closer to 0 But I like the extra movement down, so I'm going to leave it down here around minus 2.5. And now that you've added in that movement and you've kind of even like tempo based it, you get the release going along with the tempo, you really have enhanced this particular kick drum. And you've done it in two ways. Not only has the frequency content, has the spectrum changed, but also the movement. What's happening with this signal? What is it doing dynamically? And again, this is all about putting it into context. So again, I would say that with the case of dynamic EQ, you can use it as both a fix it and as an enhance it. And then it can be a little bit more subtle as an enhance it, as you could tell here. Small moves with this can make a pretty big difference. You probably aren't going to use dynamic EQ in a blended context, as in, it's on every single track, mainly because it's just going to end up using up a lot of CPU. That's still kind of the concern. As computers probably become faster and faster, it wouldn't surprise me if almost every single EQ that's released has some kind of dynamic control on it to, convert it into a dynamic EQ. So that's the idea with it. Definitely experiment with this on all sorts of instruments. What sometimes helps is to come up with a curve first, something that you like on the sound, and then take any of the things that you're going to be bringing down, take those gains, bring them back in close to zero, and then, set the amount that you're going to decrease with the threshold, with the ratio, etc., etc. In this plugin, in the free version, you can't actually enhance the ranges. So I couldn't have this go up. I couldn't put the ratio into negatives, for example. So it has to be, this kind of like 2-to-1 on the decrease, not 2-to-1 on the increase, or in which case 1-to-2, so to speak. With the paid version, you can do that. But just remember that by bringing down these two bands, we are enhancing what's going on in the other bands, even if we weren't putting a gain on them. It's all about that relative balance. And again, hopefully you have a good understanding of that here. I think a multiband compressor would be a lot more confusing to try to set up this kind of setting, although we could get the same effect. And if you have a little more experience, it's easier to do. However, I think when you have something like dynamic EQ, it just makes the process a lot easier. So obvious for us to see what we're doing. And to end this, let's just look at the difference with the analyzer in and then the analyzer out. So AKA the post. This is pre and this is post. So look at this movement, especially in this range here. And now look at the speed of that movement. All right, so hopefully that's been helpful for you. Again, this is completely optional. It doesn't change our thinking of EQ, but again, I think this serves as a really nice bridge as we start to move into the dynamic processors like our compressors and our limiters. All right, thanks a lot.